You think you know Henry VIII. Think again, the real story is far darker. Most people remember Henry VIII as the infamous king with 6 wives and the founder of the Church of England. But the truth behind the throne is far more disturbing than what schoolbooks would ever dare to mention. The real Henry VIII wasn't just a controversial ruler, he was a nightmarish figure whose physical decay, mental instability, and ruthless paranoia made him one of the most terrifying monarchs in British history. By the end of his reign, he wasn't so much ruling a kingdom as he was barely holding together a crumbling body and a collapsing psyche. This isn't your typical historical tale, this is the gruesome reality behind the crown. Point 1. His body became a rotting prison toward the end of his life. Henry VIII resembled more a walking corpse than a king. His health deteriorated so dramatically that he needed mechanical contraptions just to stand or move. His enormous girth, reportedly, a 54-inch waist, was supported by special chairs and lifts because walking was no longer an option. Weighing in at around 400 pounds, he was over double the average weight of a man at the time, but the weight was only part of the horror. Henry's legs were riddled with ulcerated wounds that refused to heal, massive, festering sores that leaked pus and emitted an unbearable stench. The odor was so vile that even his courtiers struggled to stay near him, often covering their faces with perfumed cloths or outright fleeing the room. Some servants drew lots to decide who would dress the king each morning, as being near him was seen as a punishment. To make matters worse, his body decayed so badly after death that his coffin reportedly burst open from the pressure of gases released during decomposition. 2. The king's mind became a wreck. Henry's physical decline was matched by a terrifying shift in his mental state, likely triggered by a traumatic brain injury from a jousting accident in 1536. He was knocked unconscious for 2 hours, a severe blow that many modern experts believe caused lasting damage to his brain. Following the injury, he became increasingly volatile, quick to anger, dangerously paranoid, and capable of shocking cruelty. It's believed he suffered from Cushing syndrome, which would explain the wild mood swings, dramatic weight gain, and chronic leg infections. Even his physicians were too frightened to suggest he was seriously ill. Criticizing the king's health was tantamount to treason. In his final years, Henry lost control over basic bodily functions. He required portable chairs at all times, and attendants had to be ready to clean up accidents. This was the same man who executed people for minor slights. His power unchecked even as his body failed him. 3. His wives suffered more than we can imagine. Everyone knows 2 of Henry's wives were executed, but the brutal reality they faced was much worse than simple death. These women endured psychological torment, political manipulation, and a terrifying lack of control over their own fates. Take Anne Boleyn. Before her execution, Henry orchestrated a campaign of lies and torture, forcing false confessions from men, one of whom was her own brother. Anne was made to witness the execution of 5 men before her own, knowing they died because of her husband's warped imagination. Catherine Howard, barely out of girlhood, was executed after Henry passed a law, declaring it treason to withhold one's sexual history from the king. He rewrote the law simply to justify killing her. Even the wives who escaped death suffered immensely. Catherine of Aragon was isolated, denied access to her daughter, and vilified until she died alone. Anne of Cleves, though spared, was so terrified of Henry that she agreed to annul their marriage and thanked him for not killing her. And Jane Seymour. She gave birth to Henry's only male heir and died days later. Henry began planning his next marriage before she was even buried. 4. His eating habits were beyond excessive. Henry didn't just eat to excess, he consumed food with the fervor of a man trying to empty his kingdom's food supply. His daily intake often exceeded 5,000 calories. While he could barely walk, he feasted like a champion, demanding whole pigs, multiple birds, exotic game, piles of bread, and oceans of wine. The royal kitchens prepared hundreds of dishes each day, many of which Henry barely touched. Over 200 staff worked tirelessly to indulge his insatiable appetite. But his obsession with food went beyond gluttony. Henry believed specific foods had magical properties: swans for elegance, venison for hunting prowess, oysters for virility. He treated his meals like a medieval apothecary spellbook. His paranoia extended to the dining table too. Every bite he took had been tested for poison multiple times, and he would wait up to 30 minutes after tasters ate, just to make sure they didn't collapse. 5. His paranoia turned the court into a nightmare. By the end of his reign, Henry had turned his palace into a web of fear and suspicion. He kept weapons by his bed, guards in his chamber, and daggers under his pillows. Every wall had hidden passages were built into his homes, not for escape from enemies, but from imagined assassins. He created layers of spies who watched other spies, and no one knew whom they could trust. Saying the wrong thing in the wrong ear could mean a quick trip to the Tower of London and a swift execution. Even his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were under surveillance. He treated them less like heirs and more like possible threats. People were executed not for what they did, but for what Henry feared they might do. The the terrifying legacy of Henry VIII. From the romanticized image of a powerful monarch with a tragic love life, the real Henry VIII was a man consumed by his own body, haunted by fear, and capable of unspeakable cruelty. He left behind not just a changed religion or a famous line of wives, but a legacy of terror, decay, and absolute power gone unchecked. History books often skim the surface. But when you peer beneath the crown, you'll find a story that rivals the darkest fiction. Even death couldn't silence the madness. The shocking legacy of Henry VIII. Think Henry VIII's reign ended with his death. Think again. This wasn't a king who went quietly into the night. Even after his final breath, the chaos continued on in the most revolting ways imaginable. In the last weeks of his life, Henry had grown so large and immobile that he needed an elaborate custom-built chair with wheels and pulleys just to move around. But that was only the beginning of the grotesque horror. His legs were covered in deeply infected, oozing ulcers. As his attendants pushed him through palace halls, chunks of rotting flesh would fall off his body, leaving a trail of decay behind him. Servants followed closely, not out of loyalty, but with rags in hand to mop up pieces of their king. By the time death came, it was more of a release for everyone else. At least his corpse had bloated to such monstrous proportions that his skin appeared glassy and stretched to the limit. The stench from his body was so vile, even his physicians men used to medieval horrors had to flee the room to vomit. Nobody dared get close enough to verify he had truly died. But the horror didn't end there. Henry's body was so distended with internal gases from decomposition that his coffin had to be specially reinforced with lead and multiple layers of wood. They hoped this would contain the foulness. It didn't. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, his coffin literally exploded. The pressurized gases tore through the lead lining, causing royal remains to burst out and splatter. The inside of the carriage, the stench was so unbearable that the procession had to come to a halt while horrified servants scrubbed the hearse with rags and buckets. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, dogs were seen licking Henry's remains off the road. The once mighty monarch, self-declared divine ruler, reduced to roadkill for stray animals. Even his burial became a spectacle of disaster. His grave had to be dug wider to fit his massive coffin, but the ground repeatedly collapsed under the weight of lead, wood, and royal rot. After several failed attempts, his remains were finally interred, but not without lingering consequences. For years after, people claimed grotesque smells and unexplainable sounds came from his tomb. While some whispered of ghosts, historians suspect it was likely just the gases from his still decomposing body escaping into the chapel air. And here's a haunting detail most history books omit. Several of the unlucky servants tasked with handling Henry's corpse died within weeks, likely succumbing to infections from contact with his putrid remains. The truth behind the legends, though, let's set the record straight. The real Henry VIII wasn't just the king with 6 wives or the man who split from the Catholic Church. He was a walking, rotting catastrophe who left trauma in his wake. Even after death, his paranoia infected the court like a disease. Nobles turned on one another, servants spied and betrayed. And no one, absolutely no one, was safe from the king's unpredictable wrath. A reign defined not just by tyranny and bloodshed, but by psychological torture and physical decay. In the end, Henry wasn't just consumed by power, he was consumed by his own body. Until even death couldn't contain the chaos he created. This isn't the sanitized version taught in classrooms. It's the raw, disturbing truth about one of England's most infamous rulers, a man whose legacy is a warning about what happens when absolute power meets absolute self-destruction.